Forget the face that launched 1,000 ships. The historical truth of the Trojan War is a ruthless, bloody struggle over maritime trade monopolies and the raw supremacy of the late Bronze Age. For centuries, poets spun tales of romantic heroes, stolen brides, and divine intervention, deliberately obscuring the brutal reality of an era defined entirely by military might and imperial ambition. This was a time of towering cyclopean walls, mass chariot charges, and violent siege warfare that systematically reduced mighty commercial citadels to ash. The Aegean world was a powder keg of rival kings, and the inevitable clash was driven by the relentless hunger for copper, tin, and absolute control of the vital shipping lanes connecting the Mediterranean to the Black Sea. Massive fleets of black-tarred galleys cut through the treacherous currents, carrying thousands of bronze-clad warriors toward a violent collision on the western shores of Anatolia. Tell us where you're watching from. What time is it for you? Settle in and prepare to witness the dust, sweat, and blood of the real ancient world. To understand the sheer scale of the violence that erupted at Troy, one must first grasp the economic engine that drove the late Bronze Age. Bronze was the lifeblood of power. It forged the swords that conquered territories, the armor that protected warlords, and the tools that carved Cyclopean stone. But bronze requires an exact recipe, 9 parts copper to 1 part tin. While copper could be violently extracted from the island of Cyprus, known then as Alatia, tin was exceedingly rare. It had to be hauled across perilous overland routes from the distant east, moving through a complex network of hostile territories, vulnerable caravans, and heavily guarded mountain passes. The warlord who controlled the flow of these metals controlled the world. This brutal economic reality created an environment of constant paranoia and aggressive expansion, where treaties were sealed with hostages and broken by the sword. There was no room for diplomacy without the backing of massed infantry and terrifying chariot divisions. The geographical location of Troy, known to the Hittites as Wilusa, transformed it into the ultimate prize in this ruthless geopolitical landscape. Situated at the mouth of the Dardanelles, the narrow, treacherous strait connecting the Aegean Sea to the Sea of Marmara and the Black Sea beyond, Troy commanded the most critical maritime choke point of the ancient world. The strait functioned much like a modern vital canal, controlling the passage of all wealth between the east and west. But nature made this passage a nightmare for ancient mariners. A powerful surface current flows constantly outward from the Black Sea, pouring into the Aegean at speeds that easily overpowered the rowers of Bronze Age galleys. Furthermore, the prevailing Aegean winds blasted fiercely from the northeast, blowing directly against any ship attempting to enter the strait. Because of these harsh navigational realities, merchant fleets carrying precious cargoes of tin, gold, amber, and enslaved labor were forced to halt. They had no choice but to pull their heavy wooden ships onto the beaches of the Troad and wait for the winds to shift, a wait that could last for weeks or even months. The kings of Troy exploited this geographical trap with absolute ruthlessness. They erected massive stone fortifications overlooking the bay and demanded exorbitant tolls, taxes, and tribute from every vessel trapped on their shores. Troy grew obscenely wealthy not by producing goods, but by extorting those who carried them. This systemic strangulation of Aegean trade infuriated the rising warlords of mainland Greece, who viewed the Trojan monopoly as a direct threat to their own expanding power. The sensory reality of this world was one of heavy industry and constant martial preparation. Across the Aegean, the suffocating heat of the bronze forges roared day and night, filling the air with the sharp, metallic tang of melted copper and the suffocating smoke of charcoal fires. Smiths hammered out thousands of leaf-shaped spearheads and heavy Naui II-type swords, preparing for an expedition of unprecedented scale. The warlords of Mycenae did not ponder the morality of their actions. They executed dissenting rivals, seized agricultural surplus to feed their standing armies, and brutally conscripted young men from surrounding villages. The drive toward war was a massive, grinding machine of extraction and enforcement. In the bustling shipyards of the Peloponnese, a fleet of flat-bottomed raiding vessels is dragged off the shingle, catching the violent offshore wind as they set their prows toward the wealthy coasts of the east. The Mycenaean war machine was an engine of pure, unadulterated conquest, engineered to extract wealth and crush any opposition across the jagged landscape of mainland Greece. The rulers of citadels like Mycenae, Tiryns, and Pylus were not benevolent kings. They were hardened warlords who consolidated power through a systemic regime of violence, intimidation, and the absolute monopolization of military technology. Their fortresses were masterclasses in defensive engineering, built with stones so massive that later generations believed they were dragged into place by giants. This cyclopean masonry, utilizing rough-hewn boulders weighing several tons, was constructed without mortar, relying on sheer weight and precise friction to withstand both earthquakes and enemy rams. The very architecture of these citadels was designed to project dominance over the surrounding valleys, serving as a constant, physical reminder to the peasant class that their labor, their grain, and their lives belonged entirely to the ruling elite sitting behind the impenetrable walls. At the apex of this brutal hierarchy stood the chariot-born elite, a class of professional killers who dominated the battlefields of the late Bronze Age. The Mycenaean chariot was a marvel of destructive engineering. Built from heat-bent elm and lightweight wicker, and rolling on four-spoked wheels, these vehicles were designed to navigate the uneven terrain of Greece and tear through infantry lines with terrifying speed. A chariot team consisted of a driver, wholly focused on maintaining control of the panicked, frothing horses, and a heavily armored warrior wielding a massive thrusting spear. These warriors wore armor that was both highly effective and psychologically terrifying. The Dendra panoply, a full-body suit of overlapping bronze plates that turned a man into a walking tank, impervious to slashing blades. On their heads rested boar-tusk helmets, a status symbol of immense value. The creation of just one boar-tusk helmet required the slaughter of dozens of wild boars, a highly dangerous undertaking that served as a martial proving ground for young Mycenaean nobles. This was a society that glorified the kill. The economy that supported these warlords was a rigid, top-down system of extreme exploitation. The palace economies operated by forcibly extracting vast quantities of wheat, barley, olive oil, and wine from the surrounding agricultural settlements. This massive surplus was hoarded in heavily guarded storerooms deep within the citadels and used to pay the craftsmen who forged the bronze weapons, built the chariots, and constructed the galleys. The warlords maintained their grip on power by monopolizing the trade of luxury goods and raw metals, ensuring that no rival faction could arm themselves effectively. When the decision was made to strike against the wealth of Troy, Agamemnon, the most powerful of the Mycenaean warlords, did not rely on impassioned speeches or appeals to unity. He utilized the raw leverage of his military superiority to force the smaller kingdoms into a grand coalition. Warlords who hesitated were threatened with immediate invasion. Their fields would be burned, their olive groves hacked down, and their populations dragged away into slavery. This was a coalition built on extortion, cemented by the exchange of highborn hostages to guarantee that the kings of Sparta, Ithaca, and Argos would commit their ships and their men to the coming slaughter. The preparation for the campaign was a monumental undertaking of extraction, stripping the Greek mainland of its resources to fuel a massive expeditionary force. The environment of these preparations was chaotic and brutal. In the massive limestone quarries of the Peloponnese, the choking, white dust coated the lungs of enslaved laborers as they dragged the massive blocks used to reinforce the staging areas. The deafening, rhythmic ring of bronze hammers striking anvils echoed across the valleys as armorers frantically repaired chariots and sharpened thousands of spear tips. Agamemnon dispatches his elite guard of heavily armed enforcers to the surrounding vassal states, physically dragging the local lords and their conscripted militias to the designated gathering point on the coast. To understand the arrogance of Troy, one must look east to the sprawling, hyper-militarized superpower that cast a massive shadow over the entire region, the Hittite Empire. Ruling from their impenetrable mountain capital of Hattusa in central Anatolia, the Hittites were the undisputed masters of Near Eastern warfare, commanding a vast network of vassal states that stretched from the Aegean coast all the way to the borders of Egypt. The kings of Troy, ruling over the territory the Hittites called Wilusa, derived much of their confidence and their brazen economic extortion from their status as a protected client state of this mighty empire. A treaty, backed by the terrifying threat of Hittite military retaliation, shielded Troy from large-scale invasions by land. The Hittite war machine was vastly different from the maritime raiders of Mycenae. It was a massive, terrestrial juggernaut capable of deploying tens of thousands of highly disciplined infantrymen across vast distances. The core of Hittite supremacy lay in their mastery of the heavily armored, three-man chariot. Unlike the lighter Mycenaean vehicles designed for rapid skirmishing, the Hittite chariot was an engine of brute force. The axle was positioned centrally under the cab, allowing it to carry a driver, a spearman, and a shield-bearer who protected the crew from incoming projectile fire. These heavy chariots were deployed in massive squadrons, engineered to smash directly into enemy infantry formations, shattering lines through sheer weight and momentum before the foot soldiers moved in to slaughter the survivors. The Hittite kings, such as the formidable Muwatalli, maintained control over their massive territory not through benevolence, but through a terrifying system of punitive expeditions and forced deportations. Rebellious cities were entirely depopulated. Their inhabitants marched hundreds of miles across the scorching Anatolian plateau to work as slave labor in imperial agricultural estates or deadly silver mines. Troy's alignment with the Hittites was entirely pragmatic. The citadel of Hizarlik was surrounded by vast, fertile plains capable of breeding the magnificent horses required for both their own defense and for tribute to the Hittite king. But the relationship was purely transactional. The Hittites demanded annual shipments of gold, fine textiles, and enslaved captives, extracted from the very merchants that Troy trapped in the Dardanelles. In exchange, Hattusa guaranteed the borders of Wilusa against the aggressive, expanding kingdoms to the south and east. The Trojan kings manipulated this alliance masterfully, playing the Hittite threat against the rising Mycenaean aggression, creating a highly volatile geopolitical standoff. The Aegean operated much like a modern Cold War proxy zone, with the massive empires of Greece and Anatolia testing each other's strength through localized raids and aggressive trade embargoes. This delicate balance of power required constant, violent enforcement. When a vassal king in western Anatolia attempted to withhold tribute or strike a separate deal with the Mycenaeans, the Hittite response was swift and merciless. Hittite commanders ordered the immediate burning of the rebels' grain stores, the execution of the ruling family, and the installation of a compliant puppet ruler backed by a garrison of seasoned troops. There were no diplomatic protests. There was only the total annihilation of the dissenting factions' economic and military base. The Hittite control of the critical trade routes moving overland from the east ensured that they had the first access to tin and iron, a new, highly guarded metallurgical technology that was slowly beginning to alter the balance of power. The harsh reality of this Eastern Empire was defined by the punishing geography of Anatolia. The blinding glare of the summer sun on bronze breastplates was matched only by the suffocating clouds of dust kicked up by marching boots. Across the hard-baked earth of the central plateau, the sharp crack of a charioteer's whip drives a massive column of infantry forward through the arid mountain passes. Hittite envoys marched down toward the Aegean coast, carrying heavy clay tablets bearing strict demands for fresh tribute, backed by the unmistakable threat of 10,000 advancing spearmen. The physical reality of Troy, rising from the mound of Hizarlik, was a monument to wealth generated by extortion and defended by bleeding-edge military engineering. King Priam did not rule over a romantic city of marble temples. He commanded a heavily fortified, deeply pragmatic citadel designed specifically to withstand prolonged sieges and protect the vast hoard of wealth extracted from the Hellespont trade routes. The defenses of Troy 6, the archaeological layer corresponding to the height of the Bronze Age, were a masterpiece of defensive architecture. The massive limestone walls, stretching over 20 feet thick at their base, were built with a distinct inward slope. This battered design was not aesthetic, it was highly functional, engineered to deflect the kinetic energy of battering rams and make it incredibly difficult for enemy sappers to undermine the foundation. Surrounding the towering upper citadel was an expansive lower city, protected by its own defensive perimeter. Recent archaeological excavations have revealed a massive, rock-cut ditch encircling the lower settlement, plunging deep into the bedrock. This trench was specifically designed to halt the terrifying charge of enemy chariots, forcing attacking forces into lethal choke points where they could be easily slaughtered by archers firing from the mud brick battlements above. Troy was essentially an armored vault guarding the most lucrative toll booth in the ancient world. Inside these walls, the wealth accumulated by the Trojan elite was staggering. Hoards of gold jewelry, lapis lazuli from Afghanistan, ivory from Egypt, and Baltic amber poured into the citadel, all taken as taxes from the desperate merchants trapped in the bay by the punishing Aegean winds. The economy of Troy was fundamentally parasitic, but it was supported by a massive, highly organized system of local agriculture and textile production. The broad plains of the Scamander River were heavily cultivated, producing the vast quantities of grain necessary to feed both the population and the massive herds of horses that the Trojans bred for war. Enslaved women, captured in raids along the coast or bought from passing slave ships, worked endlessly in massive, poorly ventilated workshops, weaving the fine woolen textiles that Troy traded for exotic metals. The Trojan ruling class maintained absolute control over this labor force through starvation tactics and the threat of severe physical mutilation. Food was centrally controlled and distributed only to those who met their grueling production quotas. As the Mycenaean threat grew, King Priam accelerated the militarization of his city. He ordered the reinforcement of the defensive gates, constructing massive wooden doors reinforced with thick bronze bands that could withstand tremendous impact. He solidified his alliances with neighboring Anatolian kingdoms, effectively paying for a massive mercenary army of Thracian, Lycian, and Phrygian warriors using the hoarded wealth of his treasury. These alliances were not based on loyalty or shared culture. They were entirely transactional, purchased with raw gold and the promise of a share in the plunder when the Mycenaean invaders were repelled. The Trojans understood that their wealth made them a target, and they turned their city into a fortress capable of bleeding any attacking army dry. The atmosphere within the citadel was dense with the mechanics of war and commerce. The heavy, suffocating stench of raw sheep's wool and chemically dyed textiles permeated the lower city, mingling with the rotting smell of the enormous middens outside the walls. Down on the bay, the groaning, splintering sounds of heavy timber echoed as trading vessels were forcibly dragged ashore by Trojan guards to be inspected and taxed. Recognizing the imminent threat of the massive fleet gathering across the sea, King Priam orders the massive bronze-reinforced gates violently barred, sealing the lower city against the coming storm. The catalyst for the Trojan War was not the abduction of a Spartan queen, but the deliberate and catastrophic severing of the Mycenaean supply lines. As the late Bronze Age reached its zenith, the demand for bronze exploded. The Mycenaean warlords required massive, continuous shipments of tin and copper to maintain their military superiority and equip their expanding armies. When Troy, emboldened by its wealth and its Hittite backing, decided to drastically raise the tolls or outright blockade Mycenaean ships attempting to pass through the Dardanelles, they triggered an immediate economic crisis on the Greek mainland. Without access to the Black Sea trade networks, the Mycenaean forges would quickly run out of tin. Without tin, they could not make bronze. Without bronze, their chariots would halt, their swords would shatter, and their violent grip on the Greek populace would rapidly collapse. Faced with the existential threat of economic strangulation, Agamemnon and the Mycenaean coalition escalated their aggressive raids along the Aegean islands. These initial skirmishes were brutal probing attacks, designed to test the response of Troy's Anatolian allies and to capture the resources necessary to fund a massive, full-scale invasion. Mycenaean raiding fleets, operating much like heavily armed pirate syndicates, descended upon poorly defended coastal settlements. They did not conquer territory to govern it. They hit the beaches with terrifying speed, killed any men capable of bearing arms, looted the granaries, and violently abducted the women and children to serve as slaves in the agricultural estates and textile workshops back in Greece. The brutality of these raids was highly systematic. The captive populations were categorized, branded, and loaded into the dark, sweltering hulls of the galleys. The looted wealth, livestock, raw metals, and grain, was strictly inventoried by the warlords and distributed to their loyal captains to maintain the fragile military coalition. This was a completely predatory economy, relying on the constant infusion of plundered goods to sustain the lavish lifestyles and massive standing armies of the ruling elite. When Troy refused to lift the blockade and continued to confiscate Mycenaean merchant vessels, the warlords realized that localized raiding was no longer sufficient. They needed to execute a decapitation strike against the center of gravity in the eastern Aegean. They had to destroy the citadel of Hizarlik and permanently shatter its stranglehold on the trade routes. The diplomatic communications of this era, recorded in the baked clay archives of the Hittite capital, reveal a landscape of veiled threats, broken treaties, and desperate maneuvering. Ahiawa, the Hittite name for the Mycenaean Greeks, was officially warned to cease their aggressive actions on the Anatolian coast. In response, the Mycenaean warlords openly funded rebellions against Hittite authority, pouring bronze weapons into the hands of insurgents to destabilize the region and draw Hittite military resources away from Troy. The entire Aegean basin was rapidly plunging into a state of total war, driven by the inescapable reality that there were not enough resources to satisfy the aggressive expansion of both empires simultaneously. The physical toll of these escalating conflicts scarred the coastal landscape. The bitter, choking taste of ash from a burned Anatolian village hung heavy in the air, mixing with the desperate, panicked screams of captured labor being herded toward the landing craft. In the shadowed halls of Mycenae, surrounded by the heavy scent of roasted meat and spilled wine, the warlords draw their heavy bronze blades, slamming them into the wooden tables to finalize the pact that will shatter the Trojan blockade. The gathering of the Mycenaean invasion force at the Bay of Aulis was a logistical nightmare of terrifying proportions, involving the mass mobilization of resources from dozens of fractured, aggressively independent kingdoms. Agamemnon did not simply call for volunteers. He utilized a brutal system of conscription and resource extraction to assemble the largest armada the Bronze Age Mediterranean had ever seen. Vassal kings were ordered to supply a specific quota of ships, fully crewed with trained rowers and heavily armed marines, along with the massive quantities of dried grain, salted meat, and fresh water required to sustain them. Failure to meet these demands resulted in immediate punitive action. A warlord who withheld his forces would find his own citadel besieged by Agamemnon's elite guard, his wealth confiscated, and his family taken as hostages to ensure absolute compliance. The construction of the fleet itself was a staggering feat of maritime engineering and forced labor. The Mycenaean galley, often painted with black pitch to seal the timber, was a deadly, flat-bottomed warship designed specifically for amphibious assaults. Unlike deep-hulled merchant vessels, these galleys were built using a complex mortise and tenon technique, where the wooden planks were locked together with tightly fitted wooden pegs, providing massive structural integrity without the need for iron nails. These ships were long and narrow, powered by up to 50 oarsmen who sat on open benches, exposed to the blistering sun and the violent sea. The galleys lacked a deep keel, allowing them to be rowed at high speeds directly onto hostile beaches, rapidly deploying heavily armed warriors right into the surf. To build this massive fleet, entire forests of pine and fir across the Greek mainland were clear-cut by conscripted labor gangs. The timber was hauled to the coastal shipyards, where thousands of carpenters, shipwrights, and sailmakers worked under the harsh whips of Mycenaean overseers. The rigging was constructed from heavily braided flax and hemp, requiring massive agricultural resources diverted from food production. The gathering at Aulis stripped the Greek economy to the bone, leaving the home citadels dangerously underdefended and the peasant population on the brink of starvation. The warlords were gambling their entire empires on the success of this expedition. If they failed to breach the walls of Troy and capture its immense wealth, their own kingdoms would rapidly collapse into violent anarchy under the crushing debt of the mobilization. The staging camp at Aulis quickly devolved into a sprawling, unsanitary, and volatile military city. Tens of thousands of warriors from rival kingdoms were crammed together on the beach, their tempers flaring in the suffocating heat as they waited for the favorable winds required to push the heavy galleys across the Aegean. Fights broke out constantly over rations, stolen weapons, and past grievances. Agamemnon and his commanders enforced order through sheer terror, publicly executing troublemakers and utilizing their heavily armored chariot guards to break up mass brawls. The delay at Aulis was not caused by angry gods demanding sacrifice, but by the complex, highly unpredictable weather systems of the Aegean, which trapped the massive fleet against the shore, forcing the commanders to burn through their precious, carefully hoarded supplies of grain. The sensory environment of the camp was overwhelmingly foul. The reek of unwashed bodies, raw sewage, and rotting food scraps hung thickly over the beach, mingling with the sharp creak of tightly wound flax rigging pulling against the heavy timber masts. Finally, as the seasonal winds shifted favorably, Agamemnon signals the command, and hundreds of black-tarred keels violently slice into the salt water, turning their heavily armored prows toward the rising sun and the coast of Anatolia. Crossing the Aegean Sea in the late Bronze Age was a highly lethal endeavor, a desperate battle against unpredictable weather, treacherous currents, and the brutal physical limitations of ancient maritime technology. The Mycenaean armada did not sail in a neat, orderly formation. It was a chaotic, sprawling mass of hundreds of low-riding galleys, highly vulnerable to the sudden, violent squalls that frequently tore across the open water. The flat-bottom design that made these ships perfect for beaching also made them highly unstable in deep swells. A sudden shift in the wind could easily capsize a heavily loaded vessel, sending 50 armored warriors plunging into the dark water, dragged straight to the bottom by the immense weight of their bronze panoplies. There were no rescue operations. A ship lost to the sea was simply written off by the warlords as an acceptable cost of the invasion. Navigation relied entirely on the visibility of landmarks and the position of the stars, making open water crossings incredibly dangerous. The fleet hugged the jagged coastlines and aggressively island-hopped across the archipelago, seeking sheltered coves every night to drag the ships ashore and rest the exhausted oarsmen. These daily landings were not peaceful rest stops. The massive army required vast amounts of food and fresh water, far more than they could carry in the cramped hulls. Consequently, the fleet functioned like a swarm of heavily armed locusts. They descended upon the small island communities of the Aegean, violently seizing their livestock, draining their wells, and stripping their fields bare of any edible crops. Any island that resisted this forced requisitioning was immediately sacked, its fighting men slaughtered, and its women dragged aboard the ships to replace the enslaved labor lost to sickness or the sea. The physical toll on the rowers and marines during the crossing was horrific. Cramped tightly together on the narrow wooden benches, the men baked under the scorching Aegean sun, their skin blistering from the constant exposure to salt spray and heat. Fresh water rations quickly grew stagnant and foul in the large clay amphorae stored in the holds. Dysentery and heat exhaustion rapidly swept through the closely packed crews, forcing the commanders to unceremoniously dump the bodies of the dead over the gunwales to prevent the rapid spread of disease. The rowers pulled the heavy wooden oars for hours on end, their hands torn and bleeding, driven forward by the relentless, rhythmic beating of wooden mallets on the deck and the constant threat of the overseer's lash. The crossing was also a tactical nightmare for the Mycenaean commanders. They had to keep this massive, fragile coalition of rival kings together in the face of immense physical hardship. Ships became separated in the frequent sea fogs, and entire contingents were blown wildly off course by the punishing Etesian winds. Agamemnon had to constantly dispatch fast-moving scout ships to herd the stragglers back into the main formation, utilizing the threat of lethal violence against any captain who attempted to abandon the expedition and turn his ship back toward Greece. The survival of the fleet depended entirely on maintaining forward momentum, pushing the men past the point of total physical collapse to reach the Anatolian shore before their supplies were completely exhausted. The reality of the sea was harsh, violent, and highly unforgiving. The stinging spray of cold seawater constantly crashed over the wooden gunwales, instantly evaporating into a blinding crust of white salt on the violently pitching deck. As the thick morning fog finally breaks, the vanguard scout ships sight the rugged, heavily fortified coastline of the Troad, instantly sounding the deep, blaring roar of the conch horns to signal the imminent assault. The initial beachhead landing at Troy was not a glorious clash of individual heroes, but a chaotic, bloody, and highly lethal amphibious assault against a fully prepared and heavily fortified enemy position. The Trojans had tracked the slow, massive progression of the Mycenaean armada across the Aegean, and they had utilized that time to militarize the shoreline. The beaches of the Troad were lined with deep defensive trenches, sharpened wooden stakes driven deeply into the sand, and hundreds of highly trained Trojan archers and spearmen waiting behind elevated earthen berms. As the flat-bottomed Mycenaean galleys violently rammed into the shallows, the defending forces unleashed a devastating barrage of bronze-tipped arrows and heavy-throwing spears, slaughtering the first wave of attackers before they could even step off the wooden decks. The physical mechanics of storming a hostile beach in heavy bronze armor were terrifying. Warriors leaping from the prows of the ships plunged straight into chest-deep, churning water, their movements severely restricted by the massive weight of their wet shields and heavy corselets. Many lost their footing in the shifting sand and simply drowned in the surf, trampled under the boots of their desperately advancing comrades. The commanders ruthlessly pushed their men forward, screaming orders over the deafening roar of the crashing waves and the terrifying screams of the dying. The vanguard forces had to absorb the massive kinetic impact of the Trojan volley, using their massive figure-8 and tower shields to create a highly vulnerable, advancing wall of rawhide and wood to protect the lighter infantry struggling out of the surf behind them. Once the leading edge of the Mycenaean force finally hit the dry sand, the nature of the battle violently shifted. The heavy Trojan chariots, previously held in reserve behind the dunes, were unleashed. They tore across the hard-packed sections of the beach, the massive elmwood wheels crushing fallen bodies into the sand. The chariot warriors thrust their long, heavy spears down into the disorganized Mycenaean ranks, utilizing the devastating combination of speed and high ground advantage to systematically break the invading infantry formations. To counter this, the Mycenaean commanders rapidly deployed their own heavily armored spearmen, ordering them to physically grab the reins of the panicked Trojan horses, driving their short, leaf-shaped bronze swords upward into the vulnerable bellies of the animals to bring the massive vehicles crashing violently down into the blood-soaked sand. Securing the beachhead required overwhelming, brutal attrition. The Mycenaean warlords simply poured thousands of men into the meat grinder of the shoreline, eventually overwhelming the Trojan defenders through sheer numerical superiority. As the surviving Trojan forces executed a disciplined retreat back toward the towering walls of the citadel, the invading army immediately transitioned from combat to rapid, heavy construction. They dragged the massive wooden galleys completely out of the water, arranging them in a vast, overlapping semicircle to form an impromptu wooden wall. Slaves and lower-class infantry were immediately ordered to dig deep trenches and chop down the surrounding coastal forests to construct a massive wooden palisade, fortifying their position against the inevitable night counterattacks. The environment of the newly captured beachhead was a scene of total, visceral carnage. The wet, sickening thud of bronze-tipped arrows piercing through layered rawhide shields mixed with the chaotic, desperate splashing of heavily armed warriors storming blindly through the red-stained surf. Ignoring the massive casualties scattered across the shoreline, the invading engineering force drives massive, sharpened wooden stakes deep into the sand, physically securing their brutal, permanent foothold on Anatolian soil. With the beachhead secured and heavily fortified, the Mycenaean commanders initiated a massive, systematic campaign of terror and economic destruction across the entire Troad. They knew that an immediate, direct assault on the towering, highly engineered walls of Troy would result in absolute slaughter for the attacking infantry. Instead, they adopted a strategy of total strangulation. The objective was to completely sever the citadel from its massive agricultural base and completely dismantle the vast network of Anatolian allies that supplied King Priam with grain, horses, and mercenary troops. Heavily armed raiding parties, led by brutal, highly effective warlords, fanned out across the fertile plains of the Scamander River, executing a scorched earth policy designed to rapidly starve the heavily populated city into submission. These coastal raids were highly organized military operations focused entirely on resource extraction. The Mycenaean forces systematically targeted unfortified farming villages, coastal trading hubs, and the vital granaries that dotted the Trojan countryside. The tactics were ruthlessly efficient. Heavily armored chariot units would rapidly encircle a settlement, cutting off all avenues of escape before the infantry moved in to execute every adult male. The true prize, however, was the surviving labor force and the agricultural surplus. Thousands of women and children were violently rounded up, stripped of their possessions, and bound with heavy hemp ropes to be marched back to the massive slave pens at the beachhead camp. These captives were then either put to work grinding the stolen grain to feed the invading army or loaded onto captured merchant ships and sent back to Greece to fuel the Mycenaean palace economies. The destruction of the Trojan agricultural engine was methodical. Mycenaean soldiers were ordered to hack down massive, centuries-old olive groves with their bronze axes, severing a vital source of oil and long-term wealth. They slaughtered massive herds of cattle and sheep that they could not carry off, intentionally letting the carcasses rot in the sun to contaminate the local water sources and spread disease among the surviving rural population. The rich, golden wheat fields that surrounded the citadel were systematically set ablaze, sending massive plumes of thick, black smoke high into the Anatolian sky. A highly visible, terrifying psychological weapon designed to demonstrate to the inhabitants trapped behind the walls of Troy that their lifelines were being permanently severed. This brutal strategy of localized annihilation also served to force Troy's regional allies to either submit to the Mycenaean coalition or face total destruction. Captured vassal leaders were brought before the Greek commanders and offered a stark choice: openly betray King Priam and provide massive supplies of timber and grain to the invading camp, or watch their own cities burn to the ground. Many, recognizing the overwhelming, destructive capacity of the Mycenaean war machine, quickly shifted their allegiances, further isolating the great citadel of Hisarlik. The wealth that Troy had violently extorted from passing merchants for generations was now being violently extracted from its own surrounding territories by a highly aggressive, highly motivated invading force. The physical reality of the raiding campaign was defined by heat, smoke, and sheer brutality. The crackling, deafening roar of a massive, burning wheat field overwhelmed the senses, sharply contrasted by the rough, biting friction of heavy hemp ropes binding the wrists of the terrified, newly captured labor force. Loaded down with heavily plundered bronze, textiles, and screaming captives, the Mycenaean raiding parties turned their chariots around, marching back toward the coast and leaving a wide, black trail of scorched earth in their wake. As the war dragged on, the rapid victory the Mycenaean warlords had promised entirely failed to materialize, and the great staging area on the beach devolved into a sprawling, pestilence-ridden slum. The siege of Troy became a grueling war of absolute attrition, where the deadliest enemy was not the bronze spears of the Trojan defenders, but the horrific, unsanitary conditions of the camp itself. Cramming tens of thousands of men, slaves, and livestock into a heavily fortified, poorly drained strip of coastline rapidly created a highly lethal biological environment. Without access to a constantly flowing river, the massive army was forced to rely on shallow, quickly dug wells that became almost immediately contaminated by the massive latrine trenches and the blood soaked into the ground from constant animal slaughter and butchery. Disease tore through the closely packed, makeshift wooden huts with terrifying speed. Violent outbreaks of dysentery and cholera, historically devastating to stationary ancient armies, decimated the ranks of the invaders far more effectively than any Trojan counterattack. The commanders desperately tried to contain the outbreaks by violently isolating the sick, dragging them to the far edges of the camp, and leaving them to die in the suffocating heat. The mortality rate was staggering. Massive funeral pyres burned continuously along the shoreline, consuming massive quantities of precious timber and filling the camp with the thick, cloying stench of roasting human flesh. The sheer volume of the dead forced the lower-class infantry to spend grueling hours digging massive, unmarked mass graves in the hard sand, a deeply demoralizing task that rapidly eroded the fighting spirit of the coalition. The logistical supply lines from the Greek mainland, stretched thin across the unpredictable Aegean, began to severely buckle. The harsh Anatolian winter brought freezing rains and powerful gales that completely halted all maritime traffic, trapping the army on the beach without any massive resupply of grain or heavily salted meat. The warlords, hoarding the rapidly dwindling supplies for themselves and their elite chariot guards, forced the common infantry to survive on heavily rationed, mold-infested barley and whatever fish they could pull from the treacherous bay. Starvation began to actively hollow out the ranks. Men grew highly insubordinate, and fights over stolen scraps of food frequently ended in lethal stabbings. The massive wealth they had been promised seemed like an impossible illusion, trapped behind the towering, heavily guarded walls of a city they could not breach. Within the command tent, the pressure on Agamemnon was immense. The coalition of rival kings was highly fragile, held together only by the rapidly fading prospect of plunder and the constant, violent enforcement of his heavy infantry guards. As the famine worsened, several vassal warlords demanded to abandon the siege entirely, threatening to load their surviving men onto the galleys and forcibly break the blockade to return home. Agamemnon met this insubordination with absolute, terrifying brutality. He established heavily armed cordons around the ships, expressly forbidding any captain from launching a vessel without his direct command, and instituted a harsh regime of lethal punishments for anyone caught hoarding rations or attempting to desert. The camp was no longer an invading army. It was a massive, desperate prison on the edge of the sea. The environmental misery of the stalemate was absolute. The putrid, suffocating stench of overflowing dysentery trenches permeated every breath, mingling with the maddening, incessant buzzing of massive swarms of flies hovering over the hastily covered, unburied dead. Recognizing the absolute breaking point of his exhausted forces, the Supreme Commander orders a highly violent confiscation of all privately held food stores, strictly rationing the remaining, rotting grain as they brace for the brutal, freezing storms of the coming winter. When the harsh winter finally broke and the plains of the Scamander River dried into hard-baked clay, the brutal, mechanized reality of late Bronze Age combat resumed with terrifying intensity. The Trojans, heavily reinforced by massive influxes of fresh Anatolian mercenaries funded by the seemingly bottomless treasury of King Priam, finally pushed out from the shadow of their towering Cyclopean walls. They did not attack in a massive, disorganized mob. They deployed highly disciplined, heavily armed chariot divisions designed to systematically shatter the weakened Mycenaean blockade. The open plain between the city and the sea became a massive, chaotic killing field, completely dominated by the devastating speed and raw kinetic power of the chariot. The physical mechanics of these chariot skirmishes were exceptionally violent. The lightweight, elm-wood Mycenaean chariots clashed violently against the heavier, more heavily armored Trojan vehicles. At high speeds, a collision between two chariots was catastrophic, instantly splintering the massive wooden wheels and violently launching the heavily armored warriors through the air to be crushed beneath the panicked, flailing hooves of the horses. The primary weapon in these high-speed engagements was the massive, heavy-thrusting spear, tipped with a long, leaf-shaped bronze blade. Warriors did not throw these weapons. They braced them against their heavy wooden shields, using the massive momentum of the charging chariot to drive the blade directly through the bronze corselets and thick rawhide armor of their opponents. The impact was capable of lifting a grown man entirely off his feet before shattering his ribcage. Infantry caught in the open during these chariot engagements faced absolute slaughter. Without the dense, highly disciplined shield wall formations that would characterize later eras, the lightly armored foot soldiers were easily isolated and systematically run down. The charioteers utilized highly coordinated hit-and-run tactics, sweeping rapidly through the disorganized infantry lines, stabbing downward with lethal precision, and immediately retreating before the surviving spearmen could effectively surround the horses. The dust kicked up by hundreds of rapidly turning wheels created a suffocating, blinding fog over the battlefield, turning the combat into a terrifying, highly disorienting nightmare of sudden, violent impacts and the deafening screams of dying horses. The injuries inflicted by the heavy bronze weaponry of the era were horrific and highly lethal. Bronze swords, specifically designed for heavy, downward hacking rather than precision thrusting, easily sheared through collarbones and severed limbs. There was no highly organized medical corps. Warriors who fell on the plain with shattered femurs or deep abdominal wounds were either immediately executed by advancing enemy troops or left to bleed to death in the suffocating dust. The warlords on both sides ruthlessly exploited the chaos, specifically targeting opposing commanders in an attempt to completely break the morale of the enemy forces. The capture of high-ranking noblemen alive was heavily prioritized, as they could be ransomed back to their citadels for massive quantities of gold, or brutally executed in full view of the opposing army to instill absolute terror. The sensory overload of the battlefield was a highly traumatizing experience. The sharp, splintering crash of massive elmwood chariot wheels violently colliding echoed across the plain, completely overwhelmed by the slick, deeply coppery scent of fresh blood rapidly mixing with the dry dust. As the sun begins to violently burn the horizon, the surviving Trojan charioteers wheel their exhausted horses around, executing a highly disciplined retreat back behind the massive, impenetrable shadow of the great stone walls. The immense psychological and physical strain of the decade-long siege eventually fractured the fragile political architecture of the Mycenaean coalition, pushing the massive, squalid beachhead camp to the absolute brink of total violent mutiny. The warlords, accustomed to swift, highly lucrative raids, were entirely unequipped to manage the massive, deeply entrenched logistical nightmare they had created. As the plunder from the surrounding, utterly devastated coastal villages completely dried up, the heavily armed kings began to violently turn on one another. The distribution of the heavily dwindling spoils, bronze armor stripped from the dead, enslaved labor, and captured grain, became the source of intense, frequently lethal disputes. Powerful vassal kings began aggressively withholding their best troops from the brutal daily skirmishes, hoarding their surviving strength in highly fortified enclaves within the wider camp, openly defying Agamemnon's supreme authority. This internal collapse was severely exacerbated by highly alarming intelligence arriving from the Greek mainland. The warlords had stripped their home citadels of almost all their heavily armed enforcers, leaving their palaces highly vulnerable. Messengers slipping through the treacherous Aegean weather brought desperate reports of massive uprisings by the heavily exploited peasant class and highly coordinated palace coups orchestrated by rival noblemen eager to seize the massive vacuums of power. The kings trapped on the beaches of Anatolia realized that even if they managed to eventually breach the massive walls of Troy, they might return home to find their own heavily fortified citadels firmly controlled by heavily armed usurpers. The entire highly interconnected system of the late Bronze Age palatial economy was actively beginning to violently unravel. Faced with the imminent, catastrophic dissolution of his entire army, Agamemnon resorted to a massive, highly systematic campaign of internal terror. He deployed his personal, heavily armored guard, men whose loyalty was directly purchased with heavily hoarded gold, to violently enforce absolute order. When a highly vocal faction of specialized shipwrights and lower-class infantry actively attempted to commandeer several galleys to forcefully return to Greece, Agamemnon did not negotiate. He ordered his heavily armed forces to immediately surround the mutineers on the beach. The leaders of the uprising were violently dragged before the assembled, completely terrified army and brutally executed, their heads heavily impaled on massive wooden stakes driven into the sand directly in front of the beached ships as a massive, highly visible deterrent. Meanwhile, behind the highly engineered defenses of Troy, King Priam actively manipulated the massive fractures in the Greek coalition. He deployed highly skilled emissaries carrying massive bribes of gold and lapis lazuli, slipping past the highly porous Mycenaean blockade at night to directly contact the disgruntled Greek warlords. He actively offered massive secret treaties, safe passage, and massive wealth in exchange for actively abandoning the siege and turning their bronze swords against Agamemnon. The war transformed from a massive physical siege into a highly complex, deeply paranoid intelligence war, where assassinations within the camp became highly common and warlords slept completely surrounded by heavily armed, deeply vetted guards. The atmosphere of the camp was thick with heavily suppressed violence and absolute paranoia. The heavy, wet thud of an executioner's massive bronze axe splitting a wooden block echoed across the heavily compacted sand, followed instantly by the deafening, completely terrified silence of a massive, violently suppressed mutinous camp. Recognizing the absolute necessity of maintaining his highly fragile grip on power, Agamemnon issues the immediate order to execute the remaining dissenters, crushing the massive rebellion with cold, heavily iron-fisted authority. Recognizing that the towering, highly engineered walls of the upper citadel were completely impervious to direct infantry assault or massive battering rams, the Mycenaean commanders entirely shifted their tactics toward the absolute, heavily methodical strangulation of the lower city. The objective was no longer to rapidly breach the defenses, but to actively make the highly packed urban environment completely uninhabitable. The Greeks launched a massive, highly coordinated engineering offensive designed to permanently sever the city's heavily guarded lifelines. Thousands of heavily conscripted slaves, working under the constant, lethal threat of Trojan archers, were violently forced to dig massive, deeply reinforced sapper trenches directly toward the highly fortified perimeter, pushing the brutal front line inch by violent inch toward the massive stone foundations. The primary target of this massive engineering assault was the highly complex water management system that sustained the massive population trapped behind the walls. Troy, heavily populated by tens of thousands of desperate citizens and Anatolian refugees, required massive, daily influxes of fresh water. The Mycenaean forces systematically tracked the massive underground aqueducts and deeply buried terracotta pipes that channeled water from the distant, heavily fortified springs in the surrounding hills. Once located, heavily armed Greek sappers violently smashed through the protective rock, deliberately filling the vital channels with massive quantities of dirt, heavily rotting animal carcasses, and human excrement. This massive, highly calculated biological attack was designed to violently accelerate the spread of dysentery and completely break the highly strained morale of the defending population. Simultaneously, the Greeks utilized highly advanced, massive siege ramps constructed from heavily compacted earth and massive timber beams, attempting to forcefully bridge the massive, rock-cut defensive ditch that completely encircled the lower city. The Trojans desperately countered this massive threat by launching highly aggressive, violently coordinated night sorties. Heavily armed Trojan shock troops, their faces completely blackened with ash to avoid detection, silently poured out of heavily concealed postern gates to aggressively attack the massive construction sites. They utilized heavily burning pitch and massive pots of violently boiling animal fat, systematically burning the massive wooden siege engines and brutally slaughtering the highly terrified, completely unprotected slave laborers trapped inside the massive, deeply dug trenches. The economic warfare also reached a highly devastating climax. The Mycenaean forces actively constructed massive, heavily fortified blockade towers entirely surrounding the citadel, physically completely cutting off any remaining overland smuggling routes. The massive storehouses of grain within Troy, heavily depleted by the deeply prolonged siege, were rapidly running completely empty. The Trojan elite, heavily guarded within the towering upper citadel, violently confiscated all remaining food from the lower city, leaving the highly desperate commoners to actively starve in the deeply squalid, tightly packed streets. The city was slowly, violently dying from the inside, crushed entirely by the massive, highly relentless weight of the heavily sustained Mycenaean military blockade. The physical environment of the deeply entrenched siege works was a heavily claustrophobic nightmare of dirt, sweat, and constant terror. The deeply suffocating darkness of a massive, suddenly collapsed sapper tunnel completely buried heavily trapped laborers alive, their desperate screams entirely drowned out by the dry, highly abrasive rasp of completely empty terracotta water jugs echoing from the city walls. Advancing rapidly through the heavily defended trench network, the massive attacking force violently completely seals off the final, heavily flowing aqueduct, aggressively cutting the great city's heavily desperate throat. The final, catastrophic breach of Troy's massive Cyclopean defenses was not the result of a magical wooden horse, but the violent culmination of aggressive siege engineering, deeply entrenched internal betrayal, and massive structural collapse. While myth obscures the tactical reality, historical evidence, and the geographical realities of the Anatolian coast point to a far more brutal combination of events. The region of the Troad sits directly atop a highly active, volatile seismic fault line. It is highly probable that a massive earthquake suddenly struck the citadel, violently fracturing the engineered limestone walls that had withstood a decade of battering rams. The inward-sloping architecture of the fortress, designed specifically to deflect direct frontal assaults and absorb the kinetic impact of enemy siege weapons, was massively vulnerable to the sudden, violent lateral shifting of the bedrock beneath it. Once the foundation cracked, the sheer weight of the Cyclopean blocks brought sections of the towering defensive perimeter crashing down in an avalanche of lethal, blinding white dust. Alternatively, the brutal reality behind the horse may have been a highly advanced siege engine. The Mycenaeans likely deployed a massive, timber-framed battering ram, heavily covered in damp horsehides to actively prevent it from being burned by the pitch and boiling fat hurled down by the desperate Trojan defenders. Under the protection of this massive wooden shell, heavily armed Greek sappers could relentlessly hammer at the weaker postern gates. A third, equally grounded historical probability involves the ruthless application of Mycenaean wealth. The impenetrable gates were likely opened from the inside by compromised Anatolian mercenaries, exhausted by starvation and actively paid off with hoarded Greek gold to betray King Priam. Whatever the physical mechanism of the breach, the bronze-banded wooden doors finally splintered, and the pressurized, enraged Mycenaean army aggressively poured into the densely packed streets of the lower city. The subsequent sack of the citadel was an act of unrestrained, systematic annihilation. The heavily armored Mycenaean shock troops did not engage in honorable combat. They executed a calculated massacre of the surviving population to permanently eliminate Troy as a geopolitical rival. They tore through the narrow, steeply winding alleys, their heavy Naui-2 bronze swords slaughtering every adult male they encountered. The desperate Trojan defenders, weakened by disease and starving from the prolonged blockade, were crushed beneath the coordinated weight of the advancing Greek infantry formations. The ruling elite, trapped within the upper citadel, were dragged from their fortified palaces and brutally executed on the stone steps of their own altars. The slaughter was designed to send a terrifying message across the entire Aegean. Resistance to Mycenaean dominance resulted in absolute, total eradication. The organized extraction of wealth immediately followed the slaughter. Greek quartermasters violently seized the hoards of gold bullion, precious lapis lazuli from Afghanistan, and massive stores of fine textiles, aggressively cataloging the plunder for distribution among the fractured warlords. The true prize, however, was human labor. The surviving Trojan women and children, traumatized and physically exhausted, were bound with heavy hemp ropes and aggressively dragged down the steep, blood-soaked paths to the waiting black galleys. These captives were entirely condemned to a lifetime of brutal forced labor, destined to work the massive textile looms and agricultural estates of the Greek mainland to fuel the palatial economies of their conquerors. The Mycenaean forces systematically stripped the city of every usable resource, from raw copper ingots to the massive timber beams that supported the palace roofs. The physical reality of the fall was defined by deafening noise and suffocating heat. The earth-shattering rumble of towering Cyclopean stone fracturing and collapsing shook the bedrock, overwhelmed only by the blinding black smoke of burning pitch and engulfed timber rooftops as Agamemnon gave the order to torch the city. The heat of the firestorm baked the surrounding clay soil into hard ceramic, leaving a permanent scorch mark in the archaeological record. Violently stepping over the piled, bleeding bodies of the slaughtered city guard, heavily armored Mycenaean shock troops pushed through the shattered main gate, driving thousands of bound captives toward the shoreline as the flames consumed the greatest commercial empire of the late Bronze Age. The destruction of Troy was absolute. The highly engineered citadel of Wilusa was violently reduced to a smoldering heap of shattered limestone and burned timber. The Mycenaean warlords accomplished their brutal objective, permanently shattering the Anatolian stranglehold on the vital Hellespont trade routes. However, their victory was entirely Pyrrhic. The decade-long mobilization of critical resources, manpower, and massive ships had bankrupted the complex palace economies of the Greek mainland. They had successfully destroyed their wealthy rival, but they had violently fractured the fragile foundation of their own empires in the process. As the heavily laden Mycenaean galleys shoved off the blood-stained beaches of the utterly destroyed Troad, they were actively returning to a world rapidly plunging into a violent systemic collapse. The interconnected late Bronze Age global economy, reliant on vulnerable maritime trade routes and centralized palatial control, was rapidly shattering under the weight of its own unsustainable warfare. The journey home was a nautical nightmare. The massive, flat-bottomed Mycenaean galleys, now dangerously overloaded with heavy bronze plunder and thousands of enslaved captives, rode extremely low in the water. As the fleets attempted to navigate the treacherous Aegean archipelago, they were struck by the violent gales of the autumn storm season. Entire squadrons of heavily armed warships were smashed against the jagged rocks of the Greek islands, sending warlords, slaves, and priceless Trojan gold plunging straight to the bottom of the sea. The survivors who finally managed to drag their battered ships onto the beaches of the Peloponnese did not find a hero's welcome. They returned to a homeland that had been stripped of its agricultural surplus and its military enforcers for 10 long years. The brutal extraction required to fund the war had pushed the heavily exploited peasant class to the absolute breaking point. The Mycenaean kings returning with their stolen wealth found their fortified citadels consumed by armed peasant revolts and violent civil wars. Rival noblemen, having seized power during the long absence of the supreme commanders, refused to surrender the palaces. The heavy infantry tactics that had conquered Troy were now deployed against fellow Greeks in the valleys of Argos and Laconia. The massive cyclopean walls of powerful centers like Mycenae, Pylos, and Tiryns would soon burn, destroyed not by foreign invaders, but from within. The massive fires that consumed the palaces baked the clay administrative tablets of the ruling class into stone, preserving the final, desperate orders of warlords attempting to deploy coastal watchers against an encroaching, nameless enemy. The highly specialized knowledge of forging heavy bronze, managing complex trade fleets, and executing monumental architecture vanished from the fractured Greek mainland for centuries. This domestic collapse was mirrored across the entire eastern Mediterranean. Massive, armed migrations of displaced populations, known historically as the Sea Peoples, began actively ravaging the unprotected coastlines of the destabilized world. These highly mobile, deeply desperate marauders, utilizing the same amphibious raiding tactics perfected by the Mycenaeans, swept down the coast of the Levant, burning the great trading hub of Ugarit to the ground and violently engaging the armies of Ramesses III on the borders of Egypt. The mighty Hittite Empire, Troy's former protector, completely fractured under the strain of internal rebellion and severed supply lines, its capital of Hattusa abandoned to the encroaching wilderness. The Bronze Age engine of power, fueled by the relentless extraction of copper and tin, simply ran out of resources and violently ground to a halt, forcing humanity to rely on the harder, more abundant metal of iron just to survive. The physical reality of the real Trojan War was not a romantic beginning, but a brutal, catastrophic end. It was the final, devastating clash of doomed empires fighting over the last scraps of a collapsing global system. The burned, shattered ruins of Wilusa stood abandoned on the Anatolian coast, slowly returning to dust beneath the harsh Aegean sun. High in the mountains of the Peloponnese, the wind howls through the blackened, roofless stone corridors of a destroyed Mycenaean palace, scattering the white ash of a fallen empire across the overgrown, heavily cracked paving stones.